It's time for this week's episode of Brandon's Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon's Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the podcast owner of the Birds and Balls, Molly Wilcox. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a sports podcast based off of women's in sports?
Yeah, so we started Birds with Balls because we are three women who play. Two of us play, and one of us is just a supporter. But we all like baseball, and we all like sports in general. And we were getting a bit fed up with the amount of men talking about sports. So we came up with the idea of doing a podcast to talk about women's sports and to talk about women's issues in sports and stuff. So yeah, we started Birds with Balls back in January, I believe, and now we are like 23 episodes in.
That's so amazing. How did you come up with the name of your podcast, Birds with Balls?
We came up with it because we were trying to figure out. We had some really dodgy ones going for quite a while, but we were just trying to come up with a slightly kind of like satire, sarcastic kind of name of and maybe like a pun. And yeah, so we were just throwing all these like random names around, and Birds with Balls came up, and we were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that sounds kind of catchy, that sounds kind of cool. And obviously that can be taken more than one way, so we were kind of like, yeah, we'll go with that.
What do you cover on your podcast?
So we talk about every and any sport that involves a woman. We also talk about a lot about women's issues or things that are going on in the world to do with women or feminism. And we also talk a lot about MLB, a sport where there is famously not a lot of women. So we have a good mix of kind of women's issues and sports and women in sport, and we celebrate women in sport and their achievements. So yeah, it's really fun.
Of course, how did you know that you wanted to have a podcast where you talk about women in sports, such as, of course, your podcast is mostly baseball, but about other sports?
So how did we know about it, did you say?
Yes. How did you know that you wanted to start?
Yeah, so like I said, we are fans of podcasts. We listen to lots of podcasts. And there's a lot of men doing podcasts about sports out there, but not a hell of a lot of women doing sporting podcasts. And we as women would like to hear more women out there talking about it. So we kind of thought, well, why not be the change that needs to happen, kind of thing.
What kind of sports do you talk about on your podcast?
We talk about all sports. So I think this last podcast, the last episode we just did, we just talked about Naomi Osaka, so tennis. We talked a bit about the Olympics coming up. So, you know, every sport that's covered there. And we will be talking lots and lots about the Olympics as they happen, and celebrating all the women's achievements that happen to do with that. And yeah, we like I said, we just talk about every sport really that involve women or that wants to involve women.
Of course, when you talk about sports, do you talk about like the NWHL, the NWSL?
So we tried to talk about the WNBA and all the sort of like women's equivalents of, yeah, like the ones that you just said. But we overheard that there's like no coverage, so we don't really get like we don't know a lot about them. So we tend to talk about the sports that we do know a bit more about, but we would love to like know a bit more about like the American sports that have women's equivalents, because yeah, we're always up for learning about cool women in sports.
What are some things that you have learned about doing a podcast with 3 people?
I think we've come to learn. Oh, I have to put this so carefully. We've come to learn each other's like strengths and weaknesses, and I think we gel really well anyway because we all love baseball and things like that. But we have come to learn that we will not always agree on one opinion, and that's absolutely fine. If anything, it makes for better listening when we don't agree. um and yeah, we've kind of got into like a bit of a dynamic now, but it would be interesting actually to think about what we have learned a bit more. I think we'll probably reflect on that when we sort of reach a year of doing it. So we're only sort of 6 months in at the moment, but yeah, it's funny how quickly you do learn like the dynamic of people. And you know, Joe's the bossy one, and Tracy's the mum of everyone. So yeah, it's a fun dynamic to be in.
What are some things that you've learned about doing, of course, balls, balls, birds with balls baseball?
I learn a lot about, so the girls, Joe and Tracy, they're very like stats orientated and like very like they know their like stats, they know their things like that. So I've learned a lot about that, because prior to doing it, like I wasn't necessarily like too hung up on people's stats and stuff. Like I took each kind of game as it were, and just kind of like really enjoyed watching and tried not to get too like caught up in all the stats. But they've definitely taught me like which ones are important and which one like and why, and which ones to pay attention to and things like that. So yeah.
Of course, with your podcast, have you interviewed anybody, or is it just the 3 of y'all just talking?
We've interviewed a few people, and we've got a few interviews lined up actually. We've got a few interviews coming up that are going to be really, really exciting. We haven't revealed who they're going to be with yet, so I will keep that a secret for now. But we interviewed a guy who goes by Bubba on Baseball. In the UK, he runs a store called Dugout Classics, and you can get all your like classic jerseys from there, and he knows like everything. So he's been watching like baseball since like the 80s, and he knows everything. Like he can just pull stats out of his brain, like just fire them off, and you're like, he just amazes me. So that was a really cool interview to do, because like I said, he just tends to like, he'll just like reel off this like random fact of like, oh, like the Pirates played on this Thursday back in 1992, and it was like raining with a tiny bit of sunshine, and yeah, the Pirates hit this many home runs in that game, and you're like, what? Like, how do you know that? But yeah, he was really, really cool to interview. And they interviewed another one without me. I couldn't be a part of one of the episodes, but they interviewed Kirsty, who is very heavily involved in women's sports over here, on a professional level. And she, Kirsty Dunleavy Harris, and she came on to talk about, there was quite a bit of controversy in the British baseball world with some things that went down a couple of months ago. So she came on to talk about that and about equality and things like that. So yeah.
Of course, what advice would you give somebody looking to start their own sports podcast?
I'd say just do it. There's so many like free kind of ways of doing it now, and people want to hear your voice. Like if you've got an opinion on things, then people want to hear it. So yeah, do it. Just go for it.
What advice would you give females looking to get into the sports podcast industry?
I would say you are going to hear a lot of voices that tell you that you're irrelevant, or you don't know what you're on about, or that yeah, you don't know the sport that you think you know that well. And I have 2 very rude words for those people, but for people who want to get into it, I think yeah, like I said, just do it. People will want to hear it. There will be somebody out there who will want to hear it, and there'll be people out there that won't, but that's their choice. It's absolutely up to them. So
That's wonderful advice. Where can my listeners find, of course, your podcast, Birds with Balls, at on social media and podcast platforms?
We are at Birds with Balls across everything. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then you can find all of our podcasts on we put it out through Anchor, so they're on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Thank you again for your interview, and best of luck in your future with Birds with Balls baseball podcast.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Molly, for your interview, and best of luck.
Thanks.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.